Hi everyone, I want to comment about the Sydney siege as an Australian of Syrian descent. On Monday, I was up all night watching the tragic events unfold, as in Sydney, a terrorist held up a chocolate cafe filled with innocent people. This sleepless night wasn't the first, however. For the last 4 years, I've been watching Syria, my country of origin, go through the same thing on a daily basis. I was shocked when it started happening in a peaceful country like Syria, just as I was shocked as I watched it happen in Australia. Innocent people who just wanted a cup of hot chocolate on their way to work are now dead or injured. It brings up the question of what is responsible and how can we prevent it from happening again. I'm going to try to touch on everywhere the responsibility lies, but stay tuned because in the end, I'm going to argue that the people who are largely responsible are the ones you would least suspect. Well, the immediate blame can't escape the gunman himself. He was clearly a mentally deranged individual. The fact that one of his demands was an ISIS flag because he seemingly forgot his at home shows that he was just a lunatic and that this wasn't a sophisticated operation. Another tip that he's a crackpot is he passed a news station and an embassy and chose to hold up a chocolate cafe. Also, he was charged with a series of criminal offenses ranging from plotting the murder of his wife to sexually assaulting 6 women. He put an ad in the paper claiming that he was a spiritual healer who was an expert in numerology, astrology, and black magic. He frequently changed religious sects. When he first came to Australia, he claimed he was seeking asylum from the Iranian theocratic government because he was going from atheist to Catholic to Protestant to cult worshipper. Clearly, he was someone who wanted attention more than anything. So, can this count as a terrorist act with a political message if he was just some lone psycho? Well, you might say that those who are attracted to ISIS in the first place probably have some form of mental illness. But some of the responsibility also lies elsewhere. I say this as a Muslim, but the Muslim community needs to do a better job of weeding out the psychos. It might make Muslims indignant for me to have said this, but the fact is, you are not immune to the prevailing ignorance about what's happening in the world. Some of you are the worst offenders of that ignorance, and you're drenched in your own bias. And in the end, you're going to lose out the most as a result of it. I know some of you are not even interested in politics and are just busy going about your daily lives. In fact, I know many of you are, because I know them personally. But simply ignoring what's going on around you won't protect you from the consequences of other people's decisions. And that doesn't just go for Muslims, but for everybody. When Hizb ut-Tahrir has a meeting in Sydney and they're getting an audience, it's everyone's problem, but mainly, it's going to be the Muslim community's problem. I know there are people yesterday who didn't even leave their homes because they were afraid of a backlash caused by this psycho's actions. And to the individuals who are actually sympathetic to ISIS, stop acting like the victims. You are not immune to being imperialist oppressors. ISIS's main goal is to go overseas and kill people in order to steal their land. And the most disgusting thing of all is they're acting as though they're being oppressed while they're doing it. So, get off your high horse, you murderous, delusional pawns. And if you're some bogan who is thinking about attacking random Muslims going about their day-to-day lives, think again. I know a headscarved Iraqi woman that was harassed yesterday at a petrol station. What her ignorant harasser cannot fathom is that Iraq has faced far more terrorism than Australia. Iraq has suffered a countless barrage of car bombings, and that doesn't even include the US bombings. Only last month, my friend called me upset that her friend had died in a car bomb in Iraq. So why would you blame the people who are bigger victims of terrorism than you are? Your ignorance is part of the problem, and you're only going to provide the crazies with the propaganda they need to recruit more crazies. So can't you see that? Educate yourself before you misdirect your rage. You might think of blaming the courts who allowed the gunman out on bail. You may blame the psychiatrist who didn't put him in an institution. You may blame those who gave him asylum in Australia in the first place, even though his original country, Iran, warned Australia about him. Australia gave him asylum because he called himself a liberal running away from Iranian theocracy. The irony. The Australian government, which is anti-Iranian, found his rhetoric useful. In fact, allowed this reject of society to live here. But I told you that the majority of the blame goes to those who you would least suspect. I think we can agree that what happened was unprecedented in Australian history. And it is a reflection of the fact that the world has had a heightened risk of terrorism now more than ever before, especially over the last 3 years. But Muslims have been living in Australia for generations, so what's changed? They keep telling us about the rise of ISIS and the increased risk of terror that has come with it. But has the media ever told you how ISIS came about? If you recall, 4 years ago was the start of the Arab Spring. The Australian media told us that it was a wave of democratic uprisings taking the Middle East by storm. In reality, the uprisings were led by religious extremists against the only remaining secular governments of the Middle East, and the United States supported them. One of the first countries to go through an Arab Spring is in Egypt. Obama called on the Egyptian dictator Mubarak to step down. But what replaced him, the next country where an uprising took place? The US stepped in with airstrikes to support the so-called democratic rebels in overthrowing and lynching Gaddafi. And as soon as they did, well, then to Syria. And what has happened since? ISIS and Al-Qaeda are... The US and its allies are directly responsible. The rebels, they even openly told the Independent an Al-Qaeda terrorist, and he was using it against the Syrian army. You see, what Sydney suffered through yesterday, Syria has been suffering from for 3 years. One man in Sydney was able to stop the entire Sydney CBD. In Syria, there are at least 40,000 like him. What happened in Sydney happens every single day in Syria, and the terrorists aren't just taking cafes hostage, they are taking entire cities hostage. In Australia, we are lucky to have a professionally trained and well-funded police force. But if you can imagine how much this one incident cost the state of New South Wales, and project that and assume it is a weekly occurrence, it would cripple the economy. Australia is worried about the threat of terrorists coming in from overseas. Syria is worried about the terrorists coming in from Australia. Right now, there is at least 150 Australians fighting for ISIS in Syria. Some were captured by the Syrian army and are in jail. But I think Sydney is still a hotbed of radicalization, and it began to fester at the start of the Arab Spring. Are you finding it hard to believe that the US government supported the rise of terrorism? Well, Hizb ut-Tahrir is an extremist movement in Sydney. In 2009, Obama had one of his the hypocritical US foreign policy of backing extremists to get rid of government. The same American politicians who were involved in backing terrorists in the Middle East as recently as today were interviewed on Australian TV yesterday to express their sympathy over the Sydney siege. They also interviewed Netanyahu, the Israeli president, a couple of weeks like killing someone, then crying at their funeral, and it's disgusting. You must be confused right now, because you were told the US is fighting ISIS and airstriking them, but even while they superficially bomb ISIS, their NATO ally is Turkey. So how do you explain this? The US has only been bombing ISIS for 3 months, a face-saving measure, but the Syrian army has been, instead of supporting Syria, the US has sanctions on Syria, crippling their ability to fight Al-Qaeda. I was watching the ABC, and right after the story about the Sydney siege, they ran a story about the Al-Qaeda rebels attacking the Syrian army and taking over a town in Idlib. But the ABC failed to make the connection between the two events, and I felt like I was taking crazy pills. So what is the connection to Sydney? The gunman, Man Haron, was making tweets about Syria to fight against the government there. He was made to believe that ISIS is an all-powerful, unbeatable force. The extremist sheikhs that Saudi Arabia have been funding and Qatar's TV channel Al Jazeera did the rest. ISIS was born in 2006 in the fertile soil of the Iraq War.